Chapter 289. November 8, 1898. Yalu River, Neutral Zone Treaty Pavilion. The morning sun glinted off the still waters of the Yalu River, casting shimmering reflections across the canvas of the makeshift treaty pavilion built on a sandbar between the Chinese and Korean sides. The river marked not only a border between two lands, but now stood as the symbolic threshold between war and peace. The structure was simply an open-sided wooden hall draped with the flags of all attending powers, the tricolor of Amarantha, the sun and moon of Korea, the red circle of Japan, the Qing dragon, and the double-headed eagle of the Russian Empire. Inside, a long table had been laid out with maps, documents, and sealed diplomatic folders. Each side sat facing one another, flanked by aides and guards, the air thick with the unspoken weight of history. President Matthew Hesh sat at the center of the Allied delegation. To his right sat General William Caldwell and Ambassador Rowley, who had traveled ahead of the Amaranthian diplomatic mission. On his left, the Japanese ambassador and General Haruto Okada. King Gojong of Korea was absent but had sent his foreign minister as an official delegate. Beside them all sat General Lee Sang-hoon, representing the Korean Royal Army. Across from them sat the Chinese delegation, worn, stiff, and visibly uneasy. At the head sat Prince Sai, a senior Qing official who had been hastily appointed to represent the emperor. Beside him sat a stoic General Yuan Shikai, his uniform crisp but his posture weary. At the far end sat Russian General Alexei Mikhailov, an Tsarist envoy with a waxed mustache and unreadable expression. No words were spoken as the final arrivals settled into their seats. It was President Hesh who broke the silence. "Let us begin." The sound of the river flowing in the distance offered a calm backdrop to what followed. After months of bloodshed, lost lives, and shattered cities, Matthew began, his voice slow but clear. "We meet here not as enemies, but as men who have witnessed the cost of war and now seek its end." He paused and looked directly at Prince Sai. "You've requested an armistice. We are prepared to offer it, but peace must come with terms that ensure this war is never repeated." Prince Sai gave a nod. "The Emperor of China recognizes the cost this conflict has taken on all sides. The Qing government is prepared to sign an armistice, but we ask no, we implore that the terms do not humiliate China further. Our nation must recover with dignity." Matthew did not flinch. "This is not about humiliation, it's about responsibility. The invasion of Korea was a violation of sovereignty, the destruction of Seoul, the occupation of Pyongyang, the collaboration with Russian expansionism. All of these must have consequences." General Yuan finally spoke. His voice was deeper than expected, steady even under pressure. "What are your demands?" Ambassador Rowley unfolded a parchment and read aloud. Clause 1. Full withdrawal of all Chinese and Russian military forces from the Korean peninsula within 30 days. Clause 2. Recognition of Korean sovereignty, with guarantees of independence under the protection of a new trilateral alliance, Korea, Japan, and Amarantha. Clause 3. Reparations totaling 60 million taels of silver to be paid over the course of 10 years to Korea and its allies. Clause 4. No future Chinese or Russian military forces may be stationed within 200 kilometers of the Korean border. Clause 5. The establishment of a neutral trade corridor through Manchuria with shared oversight to prevent further territorial disputes. The Chinese delegation exchanged whispers. General Yuan's jaw tightened. Prince Sai cleared his throat. "These are heavy demands," he said carefully, "but not impossible." Matthew replied calmly, "You still retain your sovereignty, your dynasty remains, and your people will be spared further bloodshed." General Mikhailov leaned forward. "And the Russian Empire? What terms apply to us?" Matthew turned to him. Clause 6. Russia must cease all military operations in Manchuria and remove all advisors from Korea. Additionally, Russia must recognize the current status of Port Arthur as a shared neutral harbor for future trade, not a military base. Mikhailov's eye twitched slightly. "That last part was not in our earlier discussions." Matthew didn't blink. "The terms have evolved with the battlefield." Silence. Then Yuan spoke again, quietly. "And if we refuse?" Caldwell finally leaned forward, speaking for the first time. "Then we march on Harbin, and we don't stop until the banners of our alliance fly over every fort, depot, and rail junction from here to Vladivostok." Matthew added, "We prefer peace, but we are prepared for victory." The weight of those words lingered. Prince Sai whispered something to his aides. Yuan nodded faintly. Mikhailov said nothing, and then the Chinese prince slowly stood. "We will sign." A collective breath seemed to escape the tent. November 8, 1898, afternoon. Yalu River Treaty signing. As the sun crested overhead, the scrolls of the treaty at Yalu were laid out in triplicate, one for the Allies, one for the Qing. One for the neutral Russian observers. The representatives dipped ink pens in silence and signed their names: Matthew Hesh, Prince Sai, General Okada, General Lee Sang-hoon, General Mikhailov, reluctantly only as witness. Each signature brought with it the sound of history turning. Soldiers stationed around the tent lowered their rifles. Flags outside shifted not in war, but in wind. The treaty was done. November 10, 1898, Seoul Gyeongbokgung Palace. The palace court was filled with ministers, soldiers, civilians, and diplomats. A proclamation was read aloud by the Royal Herald, by order of the Allied High Command and in recognition of peace, signed on the 8th day of November in the year 1898. We declare the end of all hostilities upon the Korean Peninsula. The war is over. Cheers echoed through the palace grounds, drums sounded, church bells rang across Amarathia. In Tokyo, fireworks lit the harbor, and in the quiet of Pyongyang, a single Korean flag was raised over the city walls for the first time in months. November 12, 1898, Amarathia Presidential Palace. D.C. Matthew Hesh sat at his desk, a cup of coffee growing cold beside him. The telegram confirming the treaty's enforcement lay beside a fresh page of parchment. He began writing. To the people of Amarathia. We have seen war, we have endured sacrifice, and now we have earned peace. As he wrote, the faint strains of laughter echoed outside his window. The city below bustled in celebration. There was still rebuilding to be done, families to reunite, and graves to honor. But for now, the war was over and a new chapter was ready to begin. Chapter 290. November 15, 1898, Seoul, Kingdom of Korea, Royal Plaza. 3 days after the official proclamation of peace, the capital still buzzed with celebration. Banners waved from windows, bells chimed across the palace grounds, and laughter returned to the streets. Yet beneath the surface of joy, a quieter truth lingered. The war was over, yes, but it had left scars that no treaty could erase. King Gojong stood at the royal balcony of Gyeongbokgung Palace, flanked by his ministers and military officials. Below, a massive crowd had gathered: civilians, soldiers, merchants, farmers, even schoolchildren. Many held paper flags bearing the new symbol of Allied unity, 3 swords crossing beneath a rising sun. The king raised his hand, and the plaza fell into a reverent hush. My people, he began, voice solemn yet resolute, we have emerged from fire and shadow. From the moment foreign banners flew over Pyongyang, our very future stood in question. But today, we stand not as vassals or victims, but as survivors, as a free people among friends, forging a path no longer under foreign threat but of our own choosing. Applause rippled through the crowd, yet Gojong didn't smile. We have paid dearly, he continued. Thousands of our sons and daughters, soldiers, laborers, civilians have perished, towns burned, fields ruined, but we have endured. Let us now remember the dead, not with sorrow alone but with commitment to rebuild, to learn, and to never allow ourselves to be caught unprepared again. Behind him, General Lee Sang-hoon stood silently. His eyes scanned the crowd and then turned skyward, where white doves were released into the morning air, their wings flapping softly as they vanished beyond the palace walls. November 15, 1898, Kaesong Forward Amarathian Encampment. Captain Edward Harris sat alone on a wooden crate outside the makeshift mess hall. His uniform was worn and stained from weeks of continuous fighting, though now it carried the dust of travel instead of blood. In his hand was a tin cup of coffee, lukewarm and bitter. The taste didn't matter. Nearby, Korean and Amarathian engineers worked to dismantle temporary fortifications. Others were burying empty shell casings, clearing scorched debris, and repairing water systems. The sounds of hammers and shovels had replaced gunfire. It was oddly peaceful and eerily hollow. A young soldier approached and saluted. "Message for you, sir." Harris took the folded note and read quickly. It was an official reassignment, was to return to Seoul within the next 48 hours for debriefing and commendation. After that, a likely redeployment back to Amarathia. He lowered the paper slowly. Commendation for what? Killing? Surviving? Outlasting the dead? Sergeant Davis sat beside him without speaking for a moment. "Feels strange, doesn't it?" the sergeant finally muttered. "We won, but it doesn't feel like winning," Harris finished. Davis nodded. "Half the men are still sleeping in their boots. I hear one of the privates wakes up screaming every night. Had to move him near the med tent." Harris rubbed his forehead. "We'll all carry this home." November 16, 1898, Tokyo. Empire of Japan General Staff Headquarters. General Hirudo Okada stood before the Emperor's military cabinet, presenting a formal after-action report. His demeanor was respectful, precise, but laced with a noticeable edge of fatigue. "Our objectives have been met. Pyongyang has been returned to Allied control. The Qing forces have retreated beyond the Yalu. The Korean peninsula is secured. Your losses? One of the cabinet ministers asked. Significant? Okada replied without hesitation. Our 3rd and 5th divisions suffered 47 total casualties during the defense of Seoul and the counterattack from Chuncheon. We have begun repatriating remains. There was a moment of silence. The Prime Minister finally broke it. And the Americans? Reliable, Okada said. Efficient and dangerous, if ever opposed. And the Koreans? Resilient, Okada replied with respect. Braver than we anticipated. Their leadership has matured significantly under pressure. The Prime Minister nodded slowly. Good. Then we move forward. Japan must now ensure its seat at the negotiating table remains permanent. Okada said nothing, but inwardly he wondered if the next struggle would be one of diplomacy rather than gunpowder. November 17, 1898, Pyongyang Chinese Military Field Hospital General Yuan Shikai walked slowly through the medical tents, his hands clasped behind his back. The war was over, but the moans of the wounded remained. Nurses moved between cots, changing bandages, spooning rice porridge into mouths too weak to chew. A young soldier no older than 16 reached out with a bloodied hand as Yuan passed. Sir, did we win? Yuan paused. The question stabbed deeper than the boy could imagine. No, he answered softly, kneeling beside the cot. But you fought bravely. The boy smiled faintly before losing consciousness again. Yuan stood and looked around the crowded tent. This wasn't victory. It wasn't even honorable defeat. It was a reminder that strategy on a map always ended in broken bodies. Behind him, a Russian officer stepped forward. Reinforcements have arrived from Vladivostok. Orders are to consolidate the border and wait for further instructions. Yuan nodded. Then let them wait. I'm done spilling Chinese blood for imperial pride. November 18, 1898, Amerathian Naval Base Busan. Southern Korea President Matthew Hesh stood on the deck of the HMS Resolute, surrounded by naval officers and engineers. The harbor below was bustling with reconstruction efforts, new docks being laid, warships repaired, supply lines rerouted. The treaty had brought peace, but rebuilding the logistical backbone of an entire theater was a war of its own. An officer approached with a clipboard. Sir, the final logistics report for the withdrawal of our 7th Division from Seoul. We can begin partial drawdown within 2 weeks. Matthew reviewed the numbers and the Korean defense infrastructure. Progressing, General Caldwell recommends continued presence of Amerathian advisors for at least another 6 months. Matthew nodded, approved. He handed the clipboard back and turned toward the sea. Behind him, Admiral Hughes spoke quietly. Sir, may I ask, do you think it was worth it? Matthew didn't answer immediately. Ask me again in 5 years, he said at last, when Korea is standing strong, when our men are home, and when no child in Pyongyang fears the sound of marching boots. November 20, 1898, Seoul Memorial Garden, Gyeongbokgung Palace. A black stone monument had been erected in the palace's newly planted memorial garden. It bore no grand statue, no soaring pillar. Just the names, rows upon rows of names from all 3 nations who had fallen in defense of the peninsula. Beneath it, a simple inscription in 3 languages read, "In honor of those who gave their lives so that others may live in peace." Families gathered silently, placing white chrysanthemums at the base. Queen Min herself stood quietly among the mourners, accompanied by palace guards. Tears streaked down her face, but she didn't hide them. Nearby, Captain Harris stood with General Lee and General Caldwell. None of them spoke. Words were hollow here, and still, the wind carried birdsong above as the sun dipped low, casting long golden shadows across the stone. The 3 generals turned to leave. The war had ended, the healing had begun, but none of them would ever forget the cost, and they would carry it with them always. Chapter 291. November 25, 1898, St. Petersburg, Russian Empire Winter Palace, Council Chamber. The great hall of the Winter Palace was as silent as a tomb, its gilded walls, once resplendent with pride and triumph, now echoed with the somber creak of polished boots and whispered disappointment. Snow fell steadily outside, dusting the palace's grand windows with frost. Inside, Tsar Nicholas II sat at the head of a long table surrounded by his senior ministers, military advisors, and members of the imperial general staff. Across the lacquered surface of the table lay the final report, the official summary of the Russo-Chinese defeat in Korea. We underestimated them, General Ivan Dragunov said stiffly, his voice hoarse. The Amarathians fought with technology and precision we weren't prepared for. Their airships and long-range artillery dominated every open field, and their command structure efficient, flexible, not to mention the Japanese. Spat Foreign Minister Mikhailov, slamming a gloved fist on the table. Fought like dogs with a bone. 10 years ago, we would have brushed them aside like smoke. Now they bleed us from the flanks, and the Koreans emboldened like jackals. Silence fell again. Tsar Nicholas II sat unmoving, his face pale and expression unreadable. A fire crackled quietly in the hearth behind him, its warmth lost against the cold tension in the room. Is it true, the Tsar said finally, voice even, that our eastern front has collapsed entirely? General Dragunov hesitated, then gave a shallow nod. Yes, Your Majesty, the last of our divisions withdrew across the Yalu on November 18. The Chinese forces have fallen back behind their own border as well. Their morale is shattered, ours worse. So, the Tsar murmured, folding his hands, we have gained nothing from this war, nothing but dead sons and a humiliated banner. Minister Mikhailov cleared his throat. There were lessons, intelligence gaps, industrial weaknesses. Our logistical chain was stretched past breaking, and we now understand, if nothing else, that the world has changed. Changed? Nicholas turned his gaze to the minister. Explain. Mikhailov drew a breath. Amarathia, sire, they are not the power we imagined. They are more than a Western curiosity now. Their weaponry is decades ahead of ours. Their factories outproduce ours 10 to 1. Their warships unsinkable, and their president? A man not of courtly patience, but of machines and systems. He doesn't wait, he moves, and when he moves, the world shifts. The Tsar leaned back slowly. Absorbing this, then, Nicholas said coldly, do we surrender our ambitions? Shall Russia retreat from the world stage, content to be outpaced by colonies and island empires? No, Your Majesty, General Dragunov said quickly, but we must change, adapt, modernize. If we are to preserve the Russian Empire's greatness, we must become what they have become, an industrial titan, not just a land of aristocracy and conscripts. Across the table, Admiral Petrov added, we lost because our ships were outdated, our rifles jammed in the Korean mud, and our soldiers, brave though they were, marched without boots fit for the winter. The Amarathians flew reconnaissance airships that could spot our movements from miles away. We never had a chance. The Tsar narrowed his eyes. Then what do you propose? Total reform, Dragunov said. Military, economic, educational. We must close the technological gap before we're left behind permanently. And what of China? Nicholas asked sharply. They dragged us into this. Yuan Shikai promised a quick campaign, a united front. Instead, we found ourselves carrying the burden of every major battle while they bled our supply lines and retreated at every opportunity. There was no response, only uncomfortable shifting. Minister Mikhailov spoke again, more cautiously now. Beijing has sent envoys requesting diplomatic dialogue. They too are shaken by this loss. The Qing court is facing unrest. Yuan's influence has waned, and the emperor grows wary of future entanglements. Nicholas snorted softly. They seek to preserve their throne. We seek to preserve our empire. He stood suddenly, and everyone around the table rose with him. Very well, the Tsar declared. Summon the Duma. Draft proposals for immediate industrial expansion in Vladivostok and across the Trans-Siberian Railway corridor. And I want the War Ministry reorganized within the month. Our humiliation must become our forge. He turned to Petrov. Begin designs for a new fleet. No expense spared. Let Amarathia have their iron leviathans. For now, we shall build ours bigger, stronger, faster. To Dragunov, form a commission, study the battlefield tactics of the Amarathians and Japanese, train a new officer corps not of noble birth, but of merit. I want minds that can think beyond the Napoleonic line. And to Mikhailov, reach out to Berlin. If the Kaiser sees the winds as we do, perhaps we can form something stronger than silence. The world is shifting. Let us be the storm that follows. The chamber vibrated with renewed purpose, though beneath the energy lay the quiet sting of defeat. Russia had lost the war, but in the minds of its leaders it had gained a new understanding. An understanding that the future would belong to those who adapted, not those who waited. November 27, 1898. Moscow Imperial War Hospital. In a snow-dusted ward, far from the marble halls of the palace. Wounded soldiers lay beneath wool blankets, their bandages stained and eyes sunken. A priest moved quietly. Among them, murmuring prayers, letters from home were read aloud. A harmonica played faintly in a distant corner. Sergeant Nikolai Orlov, his right leg amputated at the thigh, stared silently at the ceiling. We could have won, whispered the young private beside him, if they'd given us better boots, better rifles, if command hadn't ordered us forward without maps. Orlov didn't reply. We'll go back, won't we? The private asked. One day? Orlov finally turned his head. His voice was quiet but heavy. One day, but not with the same guns, not with the same leaders. And that was all he said. December 1st, 1898, St. Petersburg Imperial Gazette. The front page bore a single headline in bold Cyrillic script: Peace in the East, Imperial Reforms to follow. Beneath it, smaller lines explained the Tsar's new directives and industrial initiative across the eastern provinces, a naval modernization act, the restructuring of military command, and new investments into telegraph infrastructure and chemical research. The defeat was not denied, but neither was it lamented. Instead, it was rebranded, a harsh lesson that would propel the Russian Empire into the new century, armed with steel, science, and sovereign resolve. And so, while the war in Korea faded into memory, the echoes of defeat rang clearly through Russia's snowbound cities. In classrooms, military academies, and shipyards, a new generation began to rise quietly, vowing that the next time the bear woke, it would not slumber again. And in the heart of St. Petersburg, beneath gilded domes and candlelit halls, a singular belief took root among the empire's elite. This was not the end, it was only the beginning. Chapter 292. December 5, 1898, Tokyo, Imperial War Ministry. The early morning light filtered through the frosted windows of the Imperial War Ministry in Tokyo, illuminating long scrolls of parchment and scattered maps. Minister of War Tanaka Masamune stood near the large conference table, hands folded behind his back as aides and officers filed into the room. At the far end, seated with imperial dignity and a quiet fire in his gaze, was General Haruto Okadano, hailed as the man who led the Japanese Imperial Army through its most grueling modern war. An aide entered swiftly, bowing. Telegram from Seoul: General, Amaranthian forces have officially begun occupation of Pyongyang. Chinese units have fully withdrawn beyond the Yalu River. General Caldwell has declared the Northern Front secured. A murmur ran through the room. Okada took the telegram, scanning its content with calm precision. It's over, then, he murmured, more to himself than to anyone present. At last, Minister Tanaka stepped forward. A formal peace will follow soon. I've received confirmation from our diplomatic mission in Beijing. The Qing court is in disarray. Their own generals are refusing further offensive operations. The Russian ambassador has also been recalled from Korea. They're done. Okada exhaled deeply. And so we win not only the battlefield, but our place in Asia's future. Tanaka nodded. It will take time, there will be rebuilding, but for the first time in our history, Japan stands not behind the Western powers, but alongside them. We've proven ourselves. General Okada turned to face the table where maps of the peninsula were still pinned with markers and enemy flags. Slowly, he began pulling the pins free one by one until nothing remained but the map of a battered land now liberated. Have the Imperial Court prepare a public statement, Okada said, and summon the emissaries. We will honor the Koreans for their sacrifice, and we will ensure the Amaranthians know they do not stand alone. December 7, 1898, Seoul, Royal Palace of the Korean Empire. The banners of all three nations, Korea, Amaranthia, and Japan, hung side by side along the long hall of the Royal Palace. Below them, a grand council gathered for the first time in peace. King Gojong stood tall in his ceremonial robes, his face weary but proud. To his left stood Queen Min, and to his right, General Lee Sang-hoon. Across the hall, General Caldwell arrived accompanied by Colonel Grant, followed closely by General Okada and several members of the Japanese High Command. This was not a negotiation, it was a shared victory. Today, King Gojong began, his voice echoing through the marble chamber. We mark the end of a war that threatened to shatter not just borders, but our very way of life, and yet we endured. Together, Korean sons bled on the same soil as Amaranthian and Japanese warriors. Our enemies believed we were weak, divided, they were wrong. A light applause followed, respectful and restrained. General Caldwell stepped forward next. On behalf of President Hesh and the people of Amaranthia, I thank the Korean people for their courage and sacrifice. This victory belongs to all of us. But we must now do more than celebrate. We must rebuild, strengthen, guard what we have earned so that no enemy may ever again threaten this land. General Okada added, let this alliance not be a temporary arrangement of war, but a foundation for peace. Japan stands ready to assist Korea's recovery and to build lasting cooperation between our three nations. King Gojong gave a solemn nod. Then let this be our new beginning. December 8, 1898, D.C., Presidential Palace. The war room in Amaranthia's capital was unusually quiet. Gone were the red alerts and constant stream of field reports. Now, the room held advisors sipping coffee, reviewing logistics schedules and reconstruction budgets. President Matthew Hesh stood at the large windows of his office, watching snow begin to fall lightly over the city. He held a letter in one hand, the final status update from General Caldwell: Pyongyang secured, border stabilized, no resistance encountered during occupation, civil order being restored. Collins stepped in quietly. Sir? Matthew turned. Yes? We've received diplomatic acknowledgement from Beijing. The Qing court accepts the ceasefire. Russian diplomats have proposed a multilateral peace conference to be held in Geneva by January. Matthew gave a slow nod. Let's accept, but make it clear this is a negotiation of terms, not parity. They lost, let them come to the table with humility. Collins smiled faintly. Yes, sir. Shall I begin drafting your public address? Matthew stepped away from the window. Yes. Tell the people the war is over. Tell them our soldiers are coming home. December 10, 1898, Pyongyang, reconstructed headquarters in the heart of the battered city. Amerathian engineers and Korean workmen hauled timber and steel across half-repaired streets. New bridges rose across the Taedong River. Markets reopened, modest but alive. Pyongyang breathed again. Captain Edward Harris stood outside what had once been a Chinese barracks, now turned over to Amerathian logistics officers. A letter from home lay folded in his coat pocket, a message from his sister in Chicago, asking if he'd be home for New Year's. Sir, one of his junior officers said, approaching, we've completed inventory of the northern depot. The last Chinese artillery pieces have been cleared. Korean engineers will be taking over fortification work from here. Harris nodded. Good. It's time for them to run their own city again. We're not conquerors, we're guests who overstayed for war. The young officer chuckled. You think they'll turn this place into a memorial? Harris looked out over the city where the Korean flag now flew proudly above the palace dome. I think they'll turn it into whatever they want now, and that's the whole damn point. December 15, 1898, port of Busan. Crowds gathered along the docks as the first Amerathian warships prepared to depart. Wounded soldiers leaned on canes or crutches, cheered by civilians and children waving small Amerathian and Korean flags. Musicians played soft marching tunes. General Caldwell stood at the end of the pier beside General Lee and General Okada. A formal farewell. Thank you, Caldwell, Lee said, offering his hand. Without you, we would have lost everything. Caldwell clasped it firmly. No, you never lost your courage, you just needed time to fight back. That was always yours to take. Okada gave a respectful bow. Until we meet again, General. Hopefully not on a battlefield, Caldwell said with a smirk. The gangplank rose slowly. Amerathian sailors saluted sharply. With a deep blast from its horn, the flagship slowly began to pull away from the dock, turning toward the open sea. Caldwell stood at the railing, wind catching his coat. As Korea faded into the mist, he whispered to no one in particular, we did it. December 20th, 1898, D.C. Presidential address. The Grand Hall was full. Senators, military brass, foreign ambassadors, and citizens packed every row. Cameras clicked, scribes wrote in shorthand and across the nation. Radios buzzed to life. President Matthew Hesh stepped up to the podium. My fellow Amerathians, he began, 5 months ago, our sons and daughters sailed across the Pacific not in search of conquest, but in defense of freedom. They faced the fires of battle, the horrors of war and the weight of history itself, and they prevailed. Applause thundered across the chamber. Today, the Korean peninsula is free. The Japanese Empire stands proudly beside us, and our enemies have withdrawn in defeat. He paused, letting the weight settle. But we do not celebrate the bloodshed, we celebrate the end of it. We do not rejoice in their loss, but in our resolve, in our unity, in the promise that the 20th century shall not be ruled by tyranny, but by nations brave enough to fight for peace. He raised his hand. Let this be the last war we ever fight, but let every nation know should war come again, Amerathia will stand ready. Thunderous applause followed. Across the country, factories rang bells. In every town square, families gathered, weeping, cheering, holding one another. The war was over, and a new era had begun. Chapter 293. January 3, 1899, Seoul. Royal Assembly Chamber. The winter sun cast pale beams through the tall stained glass windows of the Royal Assembly Chamber, illuminating the intricate patterns on the polished floor. Though the war had ended nearly a month ago, the wounds it left, both visible and invisible, still pulsed throughout the Korean Empire. But today was not a day for mourning. It was a day for reckoning, a day for rebuilding. King Gojong sat on the raised dais, flanked by Queen Min and his most trusted military advisor, General Lee Sang-hoon. Ministers of Finance, Infrastructure, and Defense gathered below, alongside foreign advisors from Amerathia and Japan. Among them, seated with quiet solemnity, was Colonel Grant, left behind by General Caldwell, to serve as Amarathia's military liaison during the reconstruction. The war has ended. King Gojong began, his voice strong but worn, but its shadow remains upon our lands. Villages were burned, bridges collapsed, families shattered. And yet we endured. He stood, stepping forward. This council convenes not to dwell on past glories, but to shape the future. Let the memory of our sacrifices guide our hand as we build a Korea that will never again be seen as weak nor divided. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the room. Queen Min placed a steadying hand on the king's arm. The time has come, she said softly but clearly, for a new vision, a modern Korea, strong, sovereign, and enlightened. General Lee stepped forward next. Our army proved its valor, but our equipment was outdated, our industry lacking. The Japanese marched in boots made in Nagasaki. The Amarathians brought rifles from Chicago and steel from Subic. We must have the same, we must build our own. Minister E, in charge of industrial development, nodded. We've already begun plans to reopen the Incheon foundries and expand the Gyeongseong arsenal, with Amarathian engineers advising. We could produce modern rifles by year's end. Colonel Grant stood respectfully. President Hesh has authorized continued military assistance and industrial advisors. Your sovereignty is unquestioned, but our partnership remains strong. What benefits Korea strengthens the Pacific. King Gojong offered a slight bow in return. Then let us begin. The council continued late into the afternoon debating, drafting, assigning committees. Roads were to be repaired. A national railway project reactivated. New schools would be built in every province, focusing on both traditional studies and modern sciences. Medical facilities would be established, staffed by a blend of Korean doctors and international partners trained abroad. And above all, the Royal Army would be modernized into a standing, professional force, never again reliant on foreign arms. Outside, in the streets of Seoul, the mood was cautious but hopeful. Flags fluttered in the breeze, and children played near soldiers returning from the north. In the markets, Korean merchants spoke of investment, of stability, of peace. For the first time in years, the future no longer felt like a distant dream. January 10, 1899, port of Vladivostok, Russian Far East. The biting cold of Russia's Pacific coast did little to temper the fury simmering inside Admiral Alexei Mikhailov. He stood on the snowy deck of the Black Eagle, watching his men load crates of returned supplies, rifles, uniforms, artillery pieces salvaged from the collapse in Korea. Behind him, a junior officer approached cautiously. Admiral, message from the ministry. You've been recalled to St. Petersburg for debriefing. Debriefing? Mikhailov muttered. They want someone to blame. The officer hesitated. There are rumors of restructuring, of demotions. Let them restructure. Mikhailov turned sharply, his coat whipping in the icy wind. But make no mistake, we were not defeated because of the men. We were defeated by arrogance. Arrogance from St. Petersburg, from the court, from generals who thought war was still won with sabers and horses. He turned back to the sea. Amarathia fights like it's already the 20th century. We fought like it was still 1860. The officer said nothing. They'll learn, Mikhailov said quietly, or they'll lose the next war before it even begins. January 15, 1899, Amarathia, Chicago military parade grounds. Snowflakes drifted lazily over the crowd, but no one seemed to care. A sea of people stretched along the parade grounds, families bundled in coats and scarves, holding signs, waving flags. Brass bands played triumphant tunes. The victory parade had begun. Leading the procession were the returning veterans of the 7th and 11th Infantry Divisions, boots polished, uniforms crisp, their faces stoic as they marched beneath the archway that bore the words, "Home from Pyongyang." Captain Edward Harris marched near the front, his rifle slung neatly across his shoulder. He saw his sister in the crowd, waving frantically from behind the line. For the first time in months, he smiled. Behind him rolled Amarathian artillery units once deployed on the Korean peninsula, now greeted with thunderous applause. At the rear came supply trains, horses, engineers. Not all had made it home, but for those who had, this moment was something to cling to. From the central platform, President Matthew Hesh watched quietly. He had given his speech already. Now he simply watched his soldiers come home. Beside him stood several foreign envoys, Korean, Japanese, even a cautious observer from Britain. All eyes were on Amarathia. not as a colonizer, but as a power that had shaped the course of an entire continent without claiming it. What now? One envoy asked quietly. Matthew didn't take his eyes off the parade. Now we wait and we lead. January 20th, 1899, Beijing, Forbidden City. Inside the ancient halls of the Forbidden City, the Qing court sat in stunned silence. Empress Dowager Cixi looked down at the list of war reparations presented by the Amorathian ambassador. It was not a punishment, it was a humiliation. Territory had not been taken, but pride had. The Qing Empire's influence over Korea was over, its alliance with Russia was broken, and its army, once feared, had been shown to be unprepared for modern war. No more excuses. She said finally, her voice cold. No more lies, begin reforms, tear down the old banners. If we don't modernize now, we'll fall behind forever. Bureaucrats bowed. The war was over, but a new race had begun, one that no empire could afford to lose. Chapter 294. February 1st, 1899, Geneva, Switzerland. International Peace Conference. Snow blanketed the rooftops of Geneva's old town as carriages arrived one after another outside the Hôtel du Palais. Inside, beneath vaulted ceilings adorned with golden filigree, the world's great powers had gathered not to wage war, but to formally end one. The peace conference room was a grand chamber of dark mahogany walls and wide windows that faced the Alps. Delegates from all belligerent nations sat in silence as the final documents were placed before them. At the center table sat President Matthew Hesch of Amorathia, flanked by two senior aides. Across from him sat Lord Ivan Golenishev of the Russian Empire and Minister Zhang Mingyuan of the Qing court. Between them, the table felt longer than it was filled, not just with ink and parchment, but pride, grudges, and unspoken consequences. Also present were observers from the United Kingdom, France, Germany, and even the Ottoman Empire, though not participants. In the conflict, all were watching closely. The shape of the future was being carved in this very room. President Hesch tapped his knuckle against the polished wood once, then spoke in a calm, even tone. Let the record show. This peace is not imposed by the barrel of a gun, but earned by the sacrifices of soldiers, the resilience of nations, and the undeniable will of free peoples. It is time to put war behind us and build something better. Lord Ivan offered a slow, diplomatic nod. Russia recognizes its strategic overreach. We accept the terms. Zhang Mingyuan, weary and visibly aged by months of turmoil, simply replied, the Qing Empire will sign. We ask only that our sovereignty be respected going forward. President Hesch met his eyes squarely. So long as it is used responsibly, Minister, it will be. At 10:44 a.m. on February 1st, 1899, the Treaty of Geneva was signed. The war was officially over. February 5th, 1899, Gyeongseong, Seoul, Korean Empire. In the streets of the capital, celebrations echoed through every district. Korean flags flew proudly from balconies, and schoolchildren marched in formation, waving small pennants and singing patriotic songs. Bells rang from newly repaired towers, and even the old Confucian academies, once hesitant about modernization, had opened their gates for a ceremonial procession. General Lee Sang-hoon stood at the balcony of the Royal Military Academy watching a battalion of cadets parade beneath him. Most of them had been too young to fight, but not too young to remember. Isn't it strange? He said quietly to Minister Choi, who stood beside him. We fought a war to stop being puppets, and now, standing here, we're free, but it still feels like we're only just beginning. Minister Choi adjusted his spectacles. That's because freedom is not a trophy, General, it's a task. The general nodded slowly, and one we cannot afford to neglect. King Gojong had declared February 5th a national holiday, Restoration Day. It would be remembered not only as the day Korea's independence was affirmed, but as the birth of the new Korean century. Inside the palace, the king held a quieter ceremony. Queen Min stood beside him as Amorathian Ambassador Charles Eddington, Japanese envoy Mori Kenta, and numerous regional dignitaries each offered formal pledges of cooperation. There were no more bayonets in the room, only words, ink, and open hands. February 10th, 1899, Tokyo, Imperial Palace. Emperor Yoshihito read the translated copy of the Treaty of Geneva in near silence. Around him stood members of the Genro and top military brass, including General Okada. When he finished, he folded the document and laid it gently on the lacquered table. Japan has proven itself, he said at last, not just to the West but to ourselves. There was no applause, no cheers, only quiet nods of respect. We fought not as a vassal, not as a student of foreign powers, but as their equal. Okada bowed deeply. The men did not flinch, Your Majesty, they fought with honor. Emperor Yoshihito looked toward the wide window that faced the rising sun. Let us honor them not just in ceremony, but in action. Begin the imperial reconstruction program. railways, schools, armories, use what we have learned. Prepare not for another war but for permanence. Minister Tanaka spoke next, and our international posture, sire? The emperor's gaze hardened. Amarathia is not our master, but they are our friend. Korea, no longer our battlefield, is now our neighbor. Let diplomacy grow where swords once crossed. With that, the room bowed as one. February 14, 1899 D.C. Amarathia office of the President. Valentine's Day in the capital was colder than usual, but Matthew Hesh hardly noticed. He sat alone in his office. Reviewing a report from the Amarathian Department of Reconstruction, thousands of troops were scheduled for demobilization. New aid was being sent to Seoul and Pyongyang. Trade negotiations were scheduled with Tokyo. And most telling of all, Congress had introduced a bipartisan bill to formally establish a Pacific Defense Accord with Japan and Korea. Collins knocked once and entered. Sir, General Caldwell is on the line. He's asking about your visit to Seoul. Matthew looked up. Tell him I'll be there next month. Quietly. No parade, no speeches, just a walk through the city. Collins smiled. He'll like that. Matthew leaned back in his chair. The people there didn't ask for our help, but they fought alongside us anyway. I owe them more than just paperwork. Anything else, sir? Matthew paused, then looked out the window at the Amarathian flag fluttering over the dome of Congress. Tell the press this is the last time I'll speak publicly about the war. The chapter is closed. Let the next president reopen it, if they must. Collins hesitated. And if another war starts? Matthew stood. Then God help them, because we won't fight it with the same boys again. February 25, 1899 Pyongyang. Northern Korea, in the ruins of what had once been a war-torn city. Children now played in the shadows of scaffolding and new construction. Vendors lined the streets, selling soup, charcoal, and tiny flags. Electric lines were being installed in the city square. A school bell rang for the first time in years. Captain Edward Harris had chosen to stay behind as a military advisor, not because he had to, but because he wanted to see the place rebuilt with his own eyes. He stood at the gates of a new hospital, constructed with Amarathian supplies and Korean labor. Korean doctors trained in Manila now walked the halls. Inside, wounded civilians and former soldiers alike received care, no matter what side they'd once fought for. Morning, Captain, said Nurse Park, a Korean woman with a thick accent and a sharper wit. Morning, Harris said with a tired smile. No gunshots last night. I call that progress. She laughed. That's because the boys with rifles now wear hard hats and carry bricks. He looked down the street, where an old artillery crater had been filled in with concrete. A park was planned for that spot. They said cherry trees would be planted in the spring. As he walked the road, Harris passed a memorial wall under construction. At the top, 3 flags would fly. Korean, Amarathian, Japanese. People still argue over who really won. One young engineer commented nearby. Harris stopped, turning to him. Doesn't matter. Why not? Because nobody lost. Chapter 295. March 2, 1899 Washington. Busy Hesh residence. East Capitol Hill. The smell of warm bread and black coffee drifted through the kitchen as sunlight poured through lace-curtained windows, bathing the breakfast table in a golden hue. The war was over. The banners had been lowered, the rifles returned to armories, and President Matthew Hesh for the first time in nearly a year woke up not to telegrams, briefings, or urgent knocks on his office door, but to the light snoring of his 4-year-old son. Sprawled across his side of the bed, Arthur, he murmured sleepily, brushing a stray curl from the boy's forehead. Buddy, you're crushing my ribs. Arthur didn't budge. He clutched a wooden toy horse in one arm and used his father's ribs as a pillow, completely content. A quiet giggle sounded from the doorway. Matthew looked up and smiled. Amber stood there, wearing a simple cream-colored morning dress. Her auburn hair pulled into a loose braid over one shoulder. On her hip was 2-year-old Sophia, who was gnawing on a biscuit and waving it like a scepter. Amber grinned. Told you he'd sneak in. He crawled into our bed around 2 in the morning, said he heard drums. Matthew sat up gently, careful not to disturb Arthur too much. Poor kid. Probably dreamed of the parade downtown yesterday. She stepped closer and leaned in for a brief kiss on Matthew's temple. Come downstairs, breakfast is ready. Before it all gets cold or Sophia feeds it to the cat again. I know, feed it, Sophia said proudly, crumbs flying from her biscuit-covered cheeks. Right? Matthew chuckled. You just happen to drop half your breakfast on the floor every morning. 20 minutes later, they were all seated at the kitchen table. A pot of scrambled eggs, Freshly baked cornbread, buttered spinach, and apple slices filled the table. Amber poured coffee for Matthew and tea for herself while Arthur munched happily on a cornbread wedge, still holding his toy horse with syrup-covered fingers. "Papa," Arthur said through a mouthful of food, "is the war all the way over now?" Matthew paused, fork halfway to his mouth. He met Amber's eyes briefly, and she gave a soft nod. It wasn't the first time Arthur had asked. "Yeah, buddy," Matthew said gently. "It's over. No more marching. No more cannon fire. Everyone's going home, even the soldiers." Arthur chewed thoughtfully. "Did you shoot the bad guys?" Amber's eyebrows lifted slightly. Matthew gave a patient smile. "No, I didn't have to. I helped the people who did, though, and I helped them stop fighting when it was time." Arthur nodded sagely. "Uncle Caldwell shot the bad guys." Amber laughed. "I think General Caldwell would like to hear he's Uncle Caldwell now. Can I be a general?" Arthur asked, eyes wide. "Only if you finish your spinach," Amber replied without missing a beat. Arthur groaned, deflating a little. Matthew leaned back in his chair, sipping his coffee. The home smelled of sunlight, warm cornbread, and the faint scent of amber soap. After months of dispatches, tents, and maps stained with coffee and blood, this quiet scene felt like something from another life, and yet it was the life he'd been fighting for all along. Later that morning, the Hesh family bundled up and walked to Lincoln Park, just a few blocks away. The snow had mostly melted, leaving patches of wet grass and slushy sidewalks. Arthur wore his little woolen cap with ear flaps. Sophia was wrapped in a too-big coat with a pink ribbon trailing behind her, and Amber carried a picnic basket filled with sandwiches, blankets, and sketch paper. The park was lively with families. Some tossed balls to excited dogs. Others guided their children along the paths still flanked by melting piles of snow. Musicians played violins near the monument steps, and newsboys shouted headlines from the street corner. Amber spread the blanket beneath a budding sycamore tree while Matthew helped Arthur climb the lower branches just high enough to feel brave, not high enough to terrify his mother. Sophia chased after pigeons, shrieking with laughter as they flew up and around her. Matthew sat beside Amber and exhaled deeply, watching their children play. "You've got that look again," Amber said, brushing hair from her cheek as the wind caught it. "What look?" "The one you used to wear before the war, like you can breathe." He smiled softly. "I feel like I can, first time in months." Amber reached into the basket and handed him a sandwich. "Then eat something. I'm not letting a peace-hungry president faint from hunger in front of half the neighborhood." Matthew took it with mock reverence. Commander-in-Chief obeys. They sat in companionable silence, interrupted only by the occasional squeal of delight from Sophia or Arthur yelling, "Look, Papa, I'm a squirrel." "I'll say this," Amber mused, sketching casually with charcoal on a small pad. "They never see the weight. The people, I mean, when you're giving a speech or signing some bill, they think you're stone and steel. But here you are, a tired man eating a sandwich and watching his kids climb trees." Matthew looked at her drawing. It was a half-finished portrait of Sophia feeding crumbs to pigeons. "They don't have to see the weight," he said quietly. "They just need to know someone is carrying it." Amber placed a hand over his. "You did, and now you don't have to, at least not alone." As the sun began to dip low on the horizon, painting the city in amber and orange, the Hesh family returned home, cheeks red from the cold and arms full of half-finished drawings, leftover sandwiches, and pine cones Arthur insisted were treasure. After a warm dinner and a bath filled with more splashing than washing, both children were tucked into bed. Amber sang a lullaby her grandmother once taught her, her voice low and soft as Arthur drifted off with his toy horse. And Sophia curled up with her blanket bunny in the hallway. Matthew leaned against the doorframe and watched them sleep for a long moment. "Do you think they'll remember this?" he asked quietly as Amber stepped beside him. "They'll remember the peace," she said, "even if they don't remember the war." They walked hand in hand down the hallway, back to their room. The fireplace crackled softly, casting warm shadows on the walls. Matthew sat on the edge of the bed, removing his shoes slowly. "I still see it sometimes," he admitted. "The trenches, the maps, the decisions I had to make." Amber knelt beside him, resting her head on his knee. "And I'll be here each time you wake up from it." Matthew ran a hand through her braid. "You know, for all the public addresses and medals, you're the one who won my war." She looked up and smiled. "That's because I never surrendered." They fell asleep that night with no gunfire, no messengers at the door, no alarms, only the sound of the wind outside and the soft breathing of the two little souls down the hall. The world had changed, but inside their quiet home it was whole. Chapter 296. March 10, 1899 Seoul, Korean Empire Veterans Rehabilitation Center. The air was still cool and crisp in Seoul, the city waking up slowly under the soft rays of the morning sun, despite the growing bustle of everyday life. Markets opening, children running through the streets, and the steady rhythm of horses' hooves on cobblestones. Matthew Hesh walked with purpose through the gates of the Veterans Rehabilitation Center. The center was newly established, and it felt almost like a symbol of the post-war recovery physically, mentally, and emotionally for both Ameranthian and Korean soldiers who had fought alongside each other during the long months of conflict. Inside, the center was a mix of medical clinics, therapy rooms, and common areas where veterans gathered, some to talk, others simply to rest. The building itself was modest but well-kept, with thick wooden beams and wide windows that let in ample light. Outside, a garden had begun to bloom, with cherry blossoms starting to bud and patches of freshly planted grass sprouting where battle had once left only dust. Matthew walked through the large hallway lined with framed photographs from the war, images of soldiers, both familiar and unknown, proudly standing together, their faces a mix of determination and exhaustion. He recognized many of the names beneath the photographs, some of whom he had met in the thick of battle. His footsteps echoed down the hallway as he approached the main gathering room. Inside, soldiers from Ameranthia, Japan, and Korea sat or stood in small clusters, talking quietly, some of them lost in their thoughts, others laughing softly. The room was filled with the hum of conversation and the occasional creak of chairs. A young attendant greeted him with a respectful bow. President Hesh, we've prepared the stage for your speech. They've all been looking forward to this. Matthew nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. Thank you. He stepped forward, his eyes scanning the room. It had been a long journey for many of these men. The horrors of war were still fresh for some. His own memories felt like a constant echo in his mind, but here, they had found solace. They had been through something together. He didn't need to say much. The presence of the veterans and the weight of their experiences spoke volumes. As he ascended the small wooden platform, a hush fell over the room. Everyone turned toward him, their gazes steady, expectant. It was an odd feeling for him being on the other side of the podium. He had spent so many months giving speeches to galvanize a nation for war, but this felt different. This was about gratitude, not victory, healing, not conquest. Gentlemen, he began, his voice clear but soft, I stand before you today with nothing but respect and admiration. You are not just heroes, you are the backbone of our future. He paused, looking out over the sea of faces in front of him. Some were young, others older. Many still wore the marks of their sacrifices. Some had scars, some walked with the aid of crutches or leaned on canes, but they all shared one thing, their resolve. The same resolve that had carried them through the horrors of war. Matthew cleared his throat before continuing. This war has been a heavy burden for all of us, not just on the battlefield, but here, among our people, our families, and our communities. The work of peace is never easy, and the wounds of war don't heal overnight. I know this, but what I see in this room today are the men who made it possible for us to move forward. He stepped closer to the edge of the platform. You fought not for glory, but for each other, for your families, for freedom, for the future of nations that were once divided, now united. Without your bravery, your sacrifice, we would not be here. He paused again, letting the weight of his words settle. I want you to know that your efforts have not gone unnoticed. Every person in Ameranthia, in Korea, in Japan owes you more than can ever be repaid, but we will try. We will build a future where your sacrifices are honored, where you have the care and the respect you deserve. A few soldiers in the crowd nodded. Others looked down at their hands, the weight of his words settling into their hearts. Your service is not over, Matthew said. You are the foundation on which we will rebuild. We will not forget what you've given. And we will ensure that your lives after war are just as valuable as the lives you defended during it. He stepped back slightly, a smile tugging at his lips, and finally, I'll leave you with this. The peace we have now is yours. You fought for it. You earned it. This is your victory too. There was a long pause before the room erupted into applause, gentle at first, but growing louder as the veterans clapped and cheered. It was heartfelt. It was real. The applause wasn't for him, it was for them, for each other. Matthew stepped down from the platform, shaking hands with a few of the soldiers as they congratulated him. One older man, his hair mostly gray and his uniform worn, clapped Matthew on the shoulder. You did good, President Hesh, he said, his voice raspy, but don't forget us now. I won't, Matthew replied, looking the man in the eye. You'll always be remembered. As the crowd began to disperse, Matthew walked over to a group of young soldiers sitting near the window. They looked up at him, their faces a mix of curiosity and respect. How are you all holding up? Matthew asked, sitting down beside them. One of the soldiers, a young man in his late teens, looked at him. We're all right, sir. It's just sometimes hard, you know, to forget. I do know, Matthew replied quietly, but you don't have to forget, you just have to learn to live with it. You're not alone in this. The young soldier smiled faintly. Thank you, sir, that means a lot. As Matthew stood to leave, his eyes scanned the room one more time. The veterans were mingling, speaking quietly among themselves. Some were already planning their futures, some were still grappling with the loss, the trauma, and the struggle of what had come before. But they were healing, they were survivors. Thank you, Matthew whispered softly to no one in particular. Before he left the center, he stood for a moment at the doorway, looking back at the men who had fought for peace not just on the battlefield but in their very lives. A part of him wished he could stay longer, to offer more words of encouragement, but he knew he had done what was needed, and now it was time for them to begin their next journey, one of healing, one of rebuilding. March 10, 1899, Washington, D.C. Hesh residence, East Capitol Hill. The soft murmur of voices filled the air as Matthew sat on the couch in the living room, his wife, Amber, and their children nearby. The weight of the day's speech still lingered on his mind, but here, in the comfort of his own home, he could momentarily push it aside. Amber was playing a game of checkers with Arthur, their 4-year-old son, who was enthusiastically telling his mother about a new game he'd learned from one of his friends at school. You're cheating. Arthur giggled as Amber made a clever move, smiling mischievously. I'm just playing smarter than you, that's all, Amber replied, raising an eyebrow. Sophia, their 2-year-old daughter, toddled around the living room, her small feet pattering softly on the wooden floors. She stopped to tug at her father's sleeve, holding up a crumpled piece of paper with a crayon drawing on it. What is it, Sophia? Matthew asked, smiling at her. Wook, Papa, Sophia said, her words a little slurred but filled with excitement. Matthew took the drawing from her tiny hands. It was a child's scribbled attempt at a house, a tree, and what looked like a sun with too many rays. That's beautiful, sweetheart, thank you. Sophia beamed and then ran off, no doubt to find something else to occupy her energy. Matthew leaned back in his chair, looking over at Amber. I'll take Arthur's side next round, he said, taking a long breath. Sure, but you'll lose, Amber teased, her smile warm and full of affection. I think I'm more focused on getting them both ready for school tomorrow, Matthew said, watching Arthur's concentration as he studied the board. Amber nodded thoughtfully. It's a strange feeling, isn't it? The quiet. Matthew nodded, his gaze softening as he watched their children play. It is. I'm just trying to make the most of it. With the peace now signed and the war behind them, he had an entire future to plan, one with Amber, Arthur, and Sophia. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't looking over his shoulder, waiting for the next crisis to emerge. He was simply living in the moment, and it felt like the beginning of something new. Chapter 297. March 15, 1899, Washington, D.C. Hesh residence. The city of Washington was experiencing one of those rare moments where the air seemed almost too calm, too peaceful. The hustle of government was still going on, but for the first time in years, it felt like the political machinery had quieted down. The war was officially over, and the dust had begun to settle. What had once been an era defined by military mobilization and political maneuvering was now being replaced by a new, quieter phase. At least, that was how it felt at the Hesh residence. Matthew Hesh sat at the dining room table, his hand absent-mindedly tapping the surface of his morning paper. The house was peaceful. Amber and the children had gone out to visit family for the day, leaving him alone with his thoughts. He wasn't quite sure what to do with the silence. It was a welcome change, of course, but the stillness felt a little foreign to him. He'd spent so much of his life in the heat of battle, both on the physical front lines and in the war rooms of diplomacy. This new normal, this calm, was something he would have to grow accustomed to. A glance out the window showed the first hints of spring, trees just beginning to bud, flowers poking through the dirt, and a thin layer of fog lifting from the streets. It felt as though nature itself was stretching its limbs and awakening after a long, hard winter. The sense of renewal was in the air, and for the first time in a long while, Matthew felt like he could breathe again. He rubbed his face, his mind wandering back to the days before the war had ended, the constant pressure of making the right decision, of keeping the balance between allies and enemies. It had been a time of constant alertness, but now? He wasn't sure what to think. What was next? The thought made him smile to himself. He had made the future once. Now it was time to let it unfold on its own terms. There was a soft knock at the door, followed by the gentle creak of it opening. Collins stepped in, his expression as composed as always. His brown hair had gone a bit grayer over the years, but his eyes still held that sharpness Matthew had always respected. Mr. President, Collins began with his customary formal tone, though it softened when he spoke Matthew's name. The latest reports from Seoul have arrived. The rebuilding efforts are progressing smoothly, and our forces are nearly ready to begin transitioning out of the region. Matthew's face softened with a hint of relief. He had been keeping a close eye on the aftermath of the war, particularly the efforts to restore order and infrastructure. The rebuild wasn't just about physical construction. It was about restoring the trust and stability that had been shattered. He trusted his allies to handle it, but he couldn't help but feel responsible for what came next. "I've been meaning to get there myself," Matthew said. Setting the paper aside and standing up, "What's the situation like? What's the mood on the ground?" Collins seemed to consider the question carefully. "In some ways, it's still fragile. You know how it is. When people are forced to rebuild from destruction, there's always the fear that things could fall apart again, but the spirit of the people is strong. Both the Koreans and the Amarathians are working together. General Lee's leadership has been instrumental in that." Matthew nodded thoughtfully. He'd heard much about General Lee's role in the reconstruction efforts. Lee's leadership had been invaluable not just on the battlefield but in guiding the people toward a new future. His legacy in Korea was beginning to take shape, and it seemed that the country was finally beginning to feel the weight of their hard-earned independence. "And Japan?" Matthew asked, glancing back at Collins. "They're keeping to their word," Collins replied. "The Japanese have made major investments in rebuilding, and their presence in the region is focused on long-term peace. General Okada is still involved, though his role is more diplomatic now than military. It seems that the Japanese are focusing on integration, not just control." Matthew smiled, the thought of it easing a bit of tension in his chest. "Good, that's what we need, a lasting peace. Not just a ceasefire, but a foundation for something better." "And what about you, sir?" Collins asked, his tone shifting slightly. "Are you ready to move on from all of this?" Matthew looked down at the floor for a moment, a quiet contemplation on his face. "It's strange," he said finally. "I thought I'd be looking ahead to more battles, more negotiations, but now I don't know. Maybe it's time to focus on what's in front of us. To focus on the people who fought, on the ones who didn't make it, and on the ones who will live with the consequences for the rest of their lives." Collins didn't say anything at first, just standing there as Matthew spoke, then nodded slowly. "I suppose the hardest part is always what comes after, but that's why we're here, sir. You've always done what was necessary. Now it's about making sure the peace holds." Matthew glanced at him, a look of resolve settling into his features. "Yes, and that means making sure we're not just making promises, we need to deliver." That afternoon, Matthew took a short walk around the neighborhood, strolling along tree-lined streets that had begun to shake off the winter chill. His thoughts drifted from policy and strategy to something more personal: Amber, Arthur, Sophia. He hadn't seen much of them in the past few weeks. The weight of the war had pulled him away from them, from his family, and he knew that he needed to reconnect, to spend time with them, to focus on their future. His family had been through the worst of it too. Even though they hadn't fought on the front lines, he owed them this time, this peace. He made a decision. When he got home, he would spend the evening with them. No work, no reports, just his family. His 4-year-old son Arthur had become fascinated with anything that moved: boats, horses, trains, anything with wheels or hooves. Matthew had been promising Arthur a trip to the waterfront for a while, and he would keep that promise today. When he arrived back at the house, he found Amber in the garden, bending down to help Sophia pick up a fallen leaf. The sight warmed his heart. Amber looked up and smiled as she saw him approach, her eyes filled with the same quiet warmth she always gave him. "Matthew," she said softly, standing up straight, "how was your day?" "It's been quiet," he said, stepping closer and placing a kiss on her forehead. "But I've made a decision. We're taking the kids out for a little adventure today." She raised an eyebrow, her smile deepening. "An adventure?" "A walk along the waterfront. Arthur's been asking about the boats again, and I promised him we'd go see them." He glanced down at their daughter, who was now standing beside him, holding a small bouquet of wildflowers in her hand. "You're coming too, right, Soph?" Sophia nodded solemnly, holding out the bouquet to him. "For you, Papa." Matthew chuckled softly, kneeling to accept the gift. "Thank you, sweet girl. I love it." Amber laughed gently and took his hand. "All right, let's make sure we don't forget anything: shoes, jackets, snacks for the walk." She paused and looked at him with a playful grin. "But you can't go without your coat. It's still chilly outside." Matthew grinned. "Deal?" The walk to the waterfront was leisurely, the crisp air carrying the sounds of the city and the distant hum of boats in the harbor. Arthur ran ahead, excitedly asking about the ships he could see from a distance, while Sophia, holding Matthew's hand, pointed at every bird and flower she saw along the way. Amber walked beside him, their conversation quiet but meaningful. They spoke of the future plans for their home, for their children, and for the future of Amarathia. When they reached the edge of the harbor, Arthur's eyes widened in delight as he ran toward the docks, staring at the boats bobbing gently in the water. "There they are, Papa." "The boats," he exclaimed, pulling on Matthew's sleeve. Matthew smiled and crouched beside him. "Yes, they are. You want to get closer?" Arthur nodded enthusiastically, and together they walked down the dock, the sound of the water against the wood beneath their feet adding to the tranquility of the moment. As they stood there, watching the boats, Matthew took a deep breath. There was peace now, real peace. The kind he had fought for, not just in wars, but in his heart. His family was here, the world was moving forward, and for once he could see the horizon without fearing the next storm. Do you think it will always be like this? Amber asked, her voice soft as she stood beside him. I don't know, Matthew said quietly, his arm around her, but I'll make sure it is for all of us. They stood together, watching their children as they explored, and for the first time in a long while, Matthew felt content. Peace had come not just to nations, but to his heart as well. Chapter 298. April 2nd, 1899, Shanghai, China. The clamor of cranes and clanking of steel echoed across the Shanghai docks. The air was thick with the smell of coal smoke and salt water as steamships bearing the bold insignia of the Hesh Corporation unloaded their cargo. Dozens of crates marked precision agricultural equipment, telegraph components, and hydraulic survey tools were hoisted carefully onto waiting carts. Few outside the supply teams knew the true contents: bolt-action rifles, breech-loading field guns, and advanced wireless telegraph, state-of-the-art military equipment for a region rapidly embracing modern warfare. Inside the Astor House Hotel, nestled behind dark oak walls and velvet drapes, Minister Zhang Mingyuan of the China sat across from Daniel Reeves, the executive director of Hesh Corporation's East Asia division. Reeves was a tall, serious man in his mid-40s, with pale blonde hair swept neatly to the side and a deep crease permanently fixed between his brows from years of negotiating supply contracts across volatile borders. Minister Zhang sipped his oolong tea slowly. Mr. Reeves, your company's shipments have proven invaluable to our modernization efforts. Our new army now drills with rifles that rival the European powers, but I must caution your deliveries have not gone unnoticed. The British and the Russians grow increasingly wary of our rapid growth. Reeves offered a polite, neutral smile. Minister Zhang, Hesh Corporation is a commercial entity. We don't influence foreign policy, we respond to need, and your government has been a very consistent client. Zhang raised an eyebrow but said nothing, swirling his tea again. We are aware of the international sensitivities, Reeves continued, and President Hesh has instructed us to ensure that our partnerships remain balanced. China is not alone in receiving our support. The Koreans and Japanese also benefit. Zhang sighed. Yes, I know, which is precisely the problem. April 10, 1899, Seoul, Korean Empire. In Gyeongseong's Central Parade Grounds, the Korean Imperial Army conducted drills with renewed strength. Rows of soldiers moved with synchronized precision, their uniforms spotless and their formation crisp. The crack of rifle fire echoed cleanly in the morning air as the men practiced volley fire using new Hesh-supplied bolt-action rifles from the shade of a decorated pavilion. General Lee Sang-hoon observed silently, his sharp eyes followed every movement, noting discipline, formation, and morale. Standing beside him was Colonel James Whitaker, a military liaison from Hesh Corporation's training division. Your troops have made remarkable progress, General, Whitaker said, folding his arms. The integration of wireless signals and modern artillery has completely changed your strategic profile. Lee nodded. We owe much to Amarathian support, but we walk a narrow road. Modernization brings strength but also scrutiny. Whitaker nodded in agreement. Peace through strength, sir, that's the Hesh Corporation motto, and we believe that a strong Korea is key to balance in the region. Lee narrowed his eyes slightly. Let's hope the others see it the same way. April 18, 1899, Tokyo, Imperial War Ministry. Inside the Grand Council chamber of the War Ministry, tension simmered beneath ceremonial calm. Maps covered the central table, adorned with red flags, deployment diagrams, and dotted railway lines extending from Tokyo to Kyushu and further across the sea. General Haruto Okada stood at the head of the room, his voice measured but firm. The Korean and Chinese militaries have advanced significantly over the past year. Hesh Corporation has played a major role in that. Their wireless technology has improved battlefield coordination by nearly 50%. Admiral Saito spoke up. Our naval development is sufficient, but we are falling behind in battlefield communications and rapid deploy artillery. If we wish to maintain regional parity, we must respond. Okada nodded. I will initiate formal procurement talks with Hesh Corporation. We need their latest systems. Minister Tanaka of War Affairs added, we must also begin internal research programs. We cannot rely solely on foreign suppliers no matter how friendly. Okada's eyes hardened slightly. Agreed, but for now Hesh remains the best partner we have. April 25, 1899 Washington, D.C. Presidential Office President Matthew Hesh stood at his tall office window, arms crossed, as Collins read from a thick intelligence dossier. British consulates in Shanghai and Jiangxiang have raised concerns. They say Hesh Corporation's arms shipments are destabilizing the regional balance. The Russians, meanwhile, claim that China's modernization could threaten Vladivostok. Matthew turned away from the window, his jaw tight. We never intended to spark an arms race. The idea was to ensure security through mutual capability. That was the premise behind all our contracts. Collins hesitated. It might be time to reassess, set boundaries, or at least facilitate dialogue. Matthew nodded slowly. Arrange a summit, neutral ground. Invite China, Korea, and Japan. If we're going to be the ones arming the region, we have a responsibility to keep the peace, too. May 5, 1899 Geneva International Summit inside the Palais des Nations beneath a high-domed ceiling and walls of gold leaf. Representatives from the China, Korean Empire, and Japan sat across from each other at a long, polished table. President Matthew Hesh sat at the head, flanked by Collins and two senior trade envoys. Matthew stood, clearing his throat. Ladies and gentlemen, we've gathered not to point fingers, but to understand one another. Each of your nations has turned to modernization in the wake of a brutal war, but if modernization becomes militarization without diplomacy, we risk repeating that horror. Minister Zhang responded first. China seeks only to defend itself. We will not apologize for protecting our sovereignty. General Lee Sang-hoon added, we support a non-aggression pact. Our forces are defensive. Korea has no interest in expansion. General Okada, representing Japan, sat still for a long moment before speaking. We are open to dialogue, but Japan will maintain strategic readiness. History has taught us not to lower our guard. Discussions stretched late into the night. Though no treaties were signed, all parties agreed to a series of transparency measures and further summits. May 12, 1899 Washington, D.C. Hesh residence back home. Matthew sat at the garden table with Amber as their children played nearby. Arthur chased butterflies. Sophia sang to herself while drawing shapes in the dirt. Amber poured tea. How was Geneva? Matthew let out a sigh. Progress, not peace, but at least they're talking. You've done what you could, she said softly. He smiled at her. It's not enough, but maybe it's the beginning. May 20th, 1899 Tokyo Imperial Palace. Emperor Yoshihito reviewed the Geneva documents with silent intensity. We shall maintain military readiness, he said at last, but we must also lead by example. He looked to General Okada. Begin cultural exchanges, schools, science partnerships. Let Japan not only stand as a sword but as a beacon. Okada bowed. Yes, Your Majesty. May 28, 1899 Seoul Royal Palace. King Gojong met with his ministers to discuss the summit. We shall pursue regional partnerships, education, railways, medical exchange, he said. Our sovereignty was preserved through war now. It must be affirmed through progress. June 5, 1899 Beijing. Forbidden City. The Qing court met beneath the crimson banners of the Dragon Throne. Minister Zhang stood before the Empress Dowager. We must continue reforms. The summit has shown we have a voice. Let's use it wisely. She nodded. Then let reform be our revolution. June 15, 1899 Washington, D.C. Presidential Office. Collins entered with a file. Sir, the Hesh Corporation has submitted a new initiative, the East Asia Cooperative Development Program. A shift from arms to infrastructure. Matthew reviewed it carefully. This is what we need. Sign it. Let's build tracks instead of trenches. June 25, 1899 Shanghai. Groundbreaking site under a blue summer sky. Dignitaries from China, Korea, and Japan gathered to witness the first spike of the East Asia Railway driven into the earth. Reeves stood beside them, now dressed in a modest suit rather than a corporate uniform. This is what Hesh Corporation stands for now, he said quietly. Not just weapons but connections.